From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. Today we're going to be talking about Afghanistan and the US-Taliban negotiations. We'll be discussing where the peace talks stand, what a deal might look like, and what it could mean for Afghanistan, the US, and the wider region. To discuss the situation, I'm joined by two of my colleagues here at MEI, Marvin Weinbaum and Ahmad Majidyar. Marvin is the director of our Afghanistan and Pakistan program, and Ahmad is a senior fellow and the director of our Iran Observe program. Thank you both for joining me today.
Great to be with you.
Our pleasure.
Ahmad, let me start with you. The talks between the U.S. and the Taliban, which are being held in Doha, seem to have made real headway over the weekend. Can you tell us what happened and what was agreed upon?
There certainly has been progress between the U.S. and the Taliban officials in the Qatar talks, and the progress has been mainly about two core issues. The first of that is about the exit of U.S. forces that the United States has accepted to withdraw all its troops from Afghanistan. And in return, the Taliban has pledged to cut all its ties with al-Qaeda and not allow the Afghan soil to be used by any terrorist groups against the United States or its allies. But there are still major stumbling blocks to a final agreement to be reached. And first of all, the Taliban still refuses to talk to the Afghan government for a political settlement to end the war. And secondly, they may be willing to have a ceasefire with the U.S. forces, but they appear to be unwilling to have a comprehensive ceasefire with the Afghan government until such a plan can be implemented.
Taking a step back, how significant is this step?
It remains to be seen because we still have a framework. We do not have a final agreement, and the devil is in the details. So there are a lot of other issues that need to be discussed. So it's a bit premature to talk about all of those. But what we see is that one big issue is that the one side of this conflict, which is the Afghan government and the Afghan people, they have been completely sidelined in these talks. And these talks have been mainly just between the United States and the Taliban. So even if a final agreement is reached between the U.S. and the Taliban, that paves the way for the withdrawal of U.S. forces, but that does not necessarily mean that that will result in peace in the country.
Marvin, what are your kind of main takeaways from this? What's your read on the situation?
Well, it's very much like it's clearly what this has done, this framework, is at least lay the ground here for what the U.S. wants most out of it, and that is some kind of confidence that we will not in the future be facing a terrorist organization that will use the soil of Afghanistan to attack the homeland. After all, that's why we went there in the first place. So our justification all these years has been, well, we're there to prevent just this kind of outcome where we have something to fear of groups. At this point in time, that may be exactly what the administration needs to be able to say, well, after all, the Taliban, whatever happens in the future, the Taliban have said to us that they are not going to align themselves with al-Qaeda, certainly not with Islamic State, and therefore it's safe for us to depart. And yes, we're concerned about the future of Afghanistan, but America first. Our interests really lie there. So as I think Ahmad is pointing out here, that what we've seen here is conceivably progress toward providing that kind of a justification. But at the same time, what we're not seeing is anything in what has been agreed to thus far. And in fact, indications that there is not very much likelihood to be an Afghan-to-Afghan discussion. So what we've seen thus far really are measures which will help us. It's hard to see how they're going to improve peace prospects for the Afghans themselves.
If I may just quickly add to this, that I think that Marvin is raising a very important point, that the Trump administration is selling this Taliban's pledge to cut ties with al-Qaeda and also not to allow Afghan soil to be used by any terrorist group as a very major concession. But the reality is that the Taliban has never acknowledged any ties with the Taliban. And secondly, it has been saying this, that they would not allow the Afghan terror to be used by any terrorist organization since the late 1990s. They made a pledge to the Clinton administration in the late 1990s on Al-Qaeda issue, but they never honored that. So there is the question of will and capability when it comes to the presence of Al-Qaeda in the country. First of all, the history of the Taliban shows that it has always had close ties with Al-Qaeda and it will continue to have. And secondly, even if the Taliban is sincere this time, then there is issue of capability. Would it be able to control all of Afghanistan and prevent these terrorist groups from operating from the Afghan soil?
As well as the question also of internal dynamics within the organization. Even if it wanted to follow through on this, can it impose that vision on the rank and file?
No, that's a very, very good question because the Taliban is not a monolithic group. And there are different branches within the Taliban, and also there is diversity of opinion between the commanders and also between the leadership. The most lethal branch of the Taliban, called the Haqqani Network, has had very close ties with Al-Qaeda since the late 1990s in the Holy War against the Soviet Union. So we cannot expect that they would cut their relationship of several decades just because of 6 days of talks with the U.S. in Qatar.
And even if they were to be at least somewhat sincere now, it's another question about whether they could control the situation. There's a strong possibility here that if the Afghan government fails, and it might very well, the state itself might be threatened by the departure of international forces. It's not just that the Americans are there. There are some 12,000, 13,000 other troops there as well, and they're likely to leave if we do. The Italians just today announced that they were prepared to leave during this year. So what we're really talking here about is the future of the state. There's no question here that without American presence on the ground, and I should mention in the air as well, there is a strong likelihood that the government will fail. There is enough dissension now within that it could even fail by itself. That is, if with elections coming up now in June, that should turn out badly, as badly as, for example, the parliamentary election, whose results, although it took place in September, results still have not been fully announced. If we see anything like we saw in 2014, it's possible here that that too will, together with even if we have not left, the mere threat of leaving has already had a deep impact within the country. People perceive that as inevitable now, and many, many Afghans are saying, what's my plan B? And for most of those who are in jeopardy, where the Taliban, even if they don't consolidate power, just to be stronger than they are now, means that their futures are in jeopardy. And so I think it's safe to predict 5 to 10 million refugees and the humanitarian crisis that's likely to accompany that.
If the state does collapse.
If what we find here is a development where not only is the Taliban not unified, so that elements of the Taliban could be fighting among themselves if things came apart, but then the government's supporters are also not uniform. And what we could say is that there could be ethnic conflict as different warlords fight among themselves as well as with the Taliban. Well, that's chaos. And that kind of chaos isn't good, obviously, for Afghanistan, but it's not good also for the regional countries. None of them would like to see a situation so uncertain as that, in which they will be then drawn into and to be playing their proxies.
I wanted to ask Ahmad about the regional dynamics at play here. Stepping back a bit from the kind of dire scenario that Marvin is laying out, what has the reaction been among players in the region to this weekend's announcement, specifically countries like Pakistan, like India, like China, like Saudi Arabia?
Well, in the broader sense, all regional countries and powers, they support a reconciliation process between the Afghan government and the Taliban that could result in sustainable peace in Afghanistan. And also, as Marvin pointed out, stability of Afghanistan is important for stability and security of the region. And these countries have suffered from instability and terrorism in Afghanistan for decades. But while in theory, all of them, they want to play a positive role in the peace process in Afghanistan, but there has been a very long-lasting rivalry between these countries, which prevents them from cooperating sincerely and constructively to bring peace to Afghanistan. And on the other hand, also, some of the regional countries, for example, Iran and Russia, which are playing a bigger role and more active role in Afghanistan now, and also they have deepened their ties with the Taliban, they have increasing tension with the United States and other geopolitical issues. For example, Iran and the United States because of the nuclear issue and also because of other regional matters. And also Russia sees the long-term presence of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan as kind of a threat. So that's why they also are not helping the United States and also the Afghan government to reach a peace process with the Kabul government. So as a result, we see a hedging strategy by the regional countries. That on the one hand, they continue to cultivate good ties with the Afghan government, but on the other hand, they also are establishing ties with the Taliban. So no matter what the eventual outcome of the conflict in Afghanistan is, their major security and economic interests are secured.
You know, the underlying problem here is for an agreement. Can they find common ground on the kind of Afghanistan that they want to see? There's no question what the government's position is. It would like to see the perpetuation of a state like it has. That is, at least the aspirations for a democratic constitutional government with providing rights, including those for women. We have on the part of the Taliban, though, every indication, and they really have not tried to avoid this kind of identification, and that is that what they want most of all is a restoration of the emirate that they controlled in the 1990s and until the U.S. intervention in 2001. That's really what their aim is, and that is an antithetical form of government from the kind that not just the Afghans, and I think it's safe to say most, really the great number of Afghans want that with the freedoms that go with it, but it's also going to be antithetical, of course, to the international community. And without the international community, no Afghan state is going to be a viable one. So we've got a fundamental problem here. Most of the discussion here about compromise runs to, well, we'll have a power-sharing arrangement. But again, the Taliban have made it very clear they don't want to be a political party. They don't want to run in elections. They don't want a parliament to decide what is legitimate. For them, there's enough guidance in Sharia law, in religious law, for them to be able to have a righteous state. So they really are in a position here where they cannot be part of a power-sharing arrangement, and that's the arrangement that not only we would like to see, and that could include, of course, the Taliban. We're prepared to have the Taliban as one of the parties here. But the Taliban are also aware of the fact that were they to compete, even if it was only a first step, where, and this could certainly be the case, where they agreed to something only to then undermine it once they were part of the system. But even if they were to agree to it, there's no way here in which we can imagine that they would accept those kinds of institutions, which, as I say, are so antithetical.
If I may very briefly add about the regional dynamics of these talks. In the Qatar talks, what we've seen is that other than the US and the Taliban, the only other external actors that have been involved in these talks are Pakistan and Qatar. The problem here is that other stakeholders like Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates have not played any role in these talks. So if they feel sidelined, if they see that any potential agreement does not secure their interests in Afghanistan, then they potentially could play the role of the spoiler.
And presumably the issue of the kind of long-standing dispute between Qatar and other states in the Arab world also plays into this.
Absolutely, yeah, because there has been this growing tension between the GCC countries that if only one side, only Qatar, for example, involved, then definitely just other countries will not be happy about it.
Marvin, if you're sitting in the government offices in Kabul, what is your read on this whole situation and kind of what is your response and what do you do next?
Well, the official position here is not one which is a highly negative one towards. It's difficult for them to do that, except to say, yes, of course, eventually we've got to talk. There can be no real progress here in the end here unless the negotiations are between the government and the Taliban. What they are concerned about greatly is that the U.S. does not strike a deal, which they would say behind their back, a deal which might very well be suitable for American interests, but not for them. They don't want the idea that somehow we might approve of an interim government and the composition thereof, and that, in effect, we would be delegitimizing the government that exists there right now. So they're very apprehensive at this point. I think that the general public is fearful. They're apprehensive, but they can't make it too public. So what the government at this point is saying is, well, let's just go slowly. Let's be careful of what we're doing. But behind the scene, they're saying, you know, we knew it was coming. The Americans were looking for a way. Obama wanted his way, but we mistakenly thought that when the new security, South Asia security policy was enunciated by President Trump, that somehow this guaranteed us a long commitment. They thought that this was, in the words that said, it's condition-based. We're not setting any timetable. But they mistakenly read that as an indefinite commitment when all it really meant was that, no, we're not going to set any date, but we could do what we want any time we decide that the time is ripe to change our position in terms of certainly having troops on the ground.
Just to briefly add to this, that the reaction from the Afghan government is increasingly becoming negative now. Because when the talks between the U.S. and Taliban started, the U.S. side had said that the ultimate goal of these talks are to facilitate direct talks between the Taliban and Afghan government for a political settlement. But now that details are emerging from these talks, that this is a deal between the Taliban and U.S. about the exit of U.S. troops, and the Afghan government is excluded from this. So that has increased the concerns amongst the Afghan leaders and among the Afghan people. And we saw recently that President Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan voiced concerns about that, and he mentioned that Afghanistan's territorial integrity, sovereignty is not something that the U.S. or the Taliban can decide upon, and these are not the issues that we can compromise. And another concern by the Afghan government is also that by directly negotiating with the U.S. and not directly engaging with the Afghan government, the Taliban aims to pave the way for the withdrawal of U.S. troops. But after that, they will try to undermine the current existing political order in the country, and rather than dealing with the government, deal with warlords, with local power holders to secure their own deals and just weaken the government even more. And amongst the Afghan people, there is also concerns that perhaps the same way that after the Soviet Union left, that the U.S. withdrawal could result in the disintegration of the government and potentially just lead to a wider civil war.
Is there any likelihood of security guarantees or anything like that that would be put in place, not just on the side of U.S. troops, but for the Afghan government to kind of protect them from an immediate Taliban attack in the aftermath of a U.S. troop withdrawal? Is there something like that at all under discussion?
There is an existing strategic partnership agreement between the United States and the Afghan government, which was signed by President Obama. Then NATO as an entity also has made its commitment to Afghanistan for the next 5 years. But now that a deal is being had in Qatar about the exit of U.S. troops, we do not know that if those agreements and pacts will be honored.
What kind of impact would this have on the U.S. counterterrorism mission in Afghanistan? Would there be some sort of a deal to leave a limited force in place, do you think?
Well, this is a very good question because this has been debated a lot of times, and this was a major debate under the Obama administration as well, because there were people like former Vice President Joe Biden who was saying that let's withdraw our troops, keep a very small footprint in Afghanistan, and we can deal with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups through drones and other CT operations, counterterrorism operations. But the problem with that idea is that the success of drone attacks, for example, in the tribal areas of Pakistan, hinges upon human intelligence about the military and intelligence assets that you have in the region. So once you withdraw that, you cannot just operate those drones from California and expect that that would be as effective against those insurgent groups there. And also, if the insurgency spreads from the periphery more to dense areas, then the drones could also result in further civilian casualties that could have backlash against the U.S. counterterrorism operations as well.
Marvin, where do you think things go from here?
Well, we're going to be looking for a resumption of the talks on the 25th of February. So that will be at least some indication about whether the feelings that have been expressed here and in Afghanistan are going to in any way influence the talks. What it has succeeded in doing is to get the dialogue and the discussion of our presence there really move that forward in this country and certainly in the international community generally. So there's more discussion of it now. There's going to be enormous pressure on the negotiators, American negotiators, to show something out of this. Having raised these expectations, and it's hard not to read in any of the newspapers here and commentaries how things are looking up in this, and that we've planted here the idea that there is progress. It will be a real fallback. Now, the interesting part about it is that if the president and his advisors are intent upon a departure here, and I think he's made himself clear that if he could see a way clear, he would do it. If Ambassador Khalilzad comes back empty-handed, he said, well, we tried, but they didn't want to step over that last step, which would be essentially two items, ceasefire and talks with the Kabul government. It's another matter whether those talks would ever go anywhere, because it's an awfully complicated procedure. As peace negotiations go on internationally, this is probably as complicated as any that we've seen. So if he comes back, though, and saying, we just could not sell them out, this could be very well justification. We're saying, the president says, well, look, we gave it our fullest effort here. This is something that now we ought to just simply look at what our interests are in this. And if we can get at least there an understanding that in exchange for our leaving, and because we've already announced we're ready to do it, half of it leaving, we've already lost some of the strength of our bargaining position on that. If we could get at least that, so we could walk away with just that much, then that's enough for us. And if, on the other hand, things look after this coming round of talks and certainly before the elections, which are scheduled, presidential elections and other elections in June, if, on the other hand, we could see progress, this could also be the basis. So I think the president can have it either way. A failure of the talks with just a minimal kind of understanding and having raised expectations now, I think that people are expecting something. Or if things would go more smoothly, then there'll also be a justification. So I think what we're looking at here in the not too long term is an American action here, which is going to more or less disengage ourselves from Afghanistan with the consequences thereof.
We'll have to leave it there. Marvin, Ahmad, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to my colleague Scott for producing today's program. We will see you all next week.
Inshallah.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.